3 widows, but only one truth. The third hides a deadly secret. Welcome to Crimson Whisper. I am your host, Bramwell. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in. I love reading each one. Now the case begins. The first morning of the new year brought with it a chilling fog that blanketed London's streets, creeping into every corner of the city, and lending an eerie quiet to the usual hustle of the metropolis. It was during this morning that a letter arrived at 221B, Baker Street, a letter that was to plunge Sherlock Holmes and I into a mystery that would grip us in its webs for weeks to come. The letter was addressed to Holmes, written in an elegant, though somewhat hurried hand. It came from a woman named Eleanor Beckett, a widow who had recently moved to London from Glasgow. She was seeking Holmes's help, but her letter offered no further details on the matter. It was peculiar, especially given the formality and suddenness of the request. Nevertheless, Holmes, ever the optimist in matters of intellect, was intrigued. As Holmes read the letter aloud, I could see his sharp mind already racing, picking apart the scant details within. Mrs. Beckett, it seemed, had recently been a widow for the 3rd time. What was it that tied her fate to such tragic ends? A woman of wealth and position, and yet her fate seemed to be a grim recurring pattern of misfortune. Holmes's fingers tapped the edge of his chair as he pondered the possibilities. 3rd widow, Watson, he mused, folding the letter. I dare say that this is no ordinary tragedy. There is a deeper game afoot, and it is one we must uncover. Our first meeting with Mrs. Beckett was set for that very afternoon. She lived in a grand townhouse near Regent's Park, a house that spoke of money, grief, and secrets. The moment we entered, I noticed the somber atmosphere, as if the house itself was mourning something lost. Eleanor Beckett was a woman in her early 40s, her face pale but composed. Her eyes, however, told a different story. Haunted, as though she had seen the shadow of death too many times, she greeted us with a quiet, almost formal manner, though there was an underlying tension in her voice. I don't know how to explain," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "but I need help. There are things, people who want to see me ruined. I fear for my life, for my safety." Holmes, ever observant, took in the scene as we sat down. The parlour was tastefully furnished, but there were signs of unease, an untouched tea set, curtains drawn tight against the light, and an air of isolation that seemed to envelop the room. Mrs. Beckett's hands were clasped tightly, and there was a lingering scent of perfume, but it was faint, as though she had tried to mask something else. "What, exactly, is the cause of your fear, Mrs. Beckett?" Holmes asked, his voice calm but piercing. She hesitated, glancing at the window as if expecting someone to appear. "I have been married 3 times, Mr. Holmes. Each time my husbands met with tragic ends, and now I fear the worst is yet to come." At this, Holmes raised an eyebrow. "A pattern, perhaps, Mrs. Beckett?" She nodded gravely. "Each time they died unexpectedly, 2 of them under mysterious circumstances. The 3rd, it was murder." The word hung in the air like a dark omen. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with interest. "And you believe that someone intends to harm you as well?" Mrs. Beckett's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, I am certain of it." Holmes stood, his mind already assembling the details. "Watson, accompany me to Glasgow," he said, almost as an afterthought. "We must investigate the connections that bind this woman's past to her present. Something tells me that the key to this mystery lies in Scotland, not London." And so, within hours, we were on a train bound for Glasgow. Holmes had already begun his usual methodical dissection of the facts, but there were more questions than answers. Why had each of Mrs. Beckett's husbands died so suddenly? And what could be the connection to her fate? The mystery deepened as we travelled, and I could feel Holmes's intellect pulling at the threads that would eventually unravel this sinister tale. As the train rolled through the fog, I found myself pondering the case. What dark secrets lay behind the veil of this woman's tragic past? And could the 3rd widow's story possibly be the key to unlocking the truth? The stage was set. The fog rolled in over the Scottish Highlands as we arrived in Glasgow, where the mystery of the 3rd widow awaited. The train rolled steadily through the mist-cloaked landscape, its rhythmic clatter serving as a steady pulse beneath the weight of my thoughts. Holmes, as always, sat in his usual detached manner, his sharp eyes flicking from the window to his notes, his mind already deep within the puzzle. I, on the other hand, found my mind lingering on the woman we had left behind, Eleanor Beckett. Her grief was real, but there was something about her story, something unspoken, that felt like it was veiled in layers of carefully constructed silence. We arrived in Glasgow late in the evening, the city's damp streets lit by flickering gas lamps that cast long shadows on the cobblestone roads. The air was colder here, a biting wind cutting through my coat as we made our way to our lodgings. Holmes had arranged for us to stay at a modest inn near the city centre, but even as we entered the warmth of the common room, my thoughts kept drifting back to the widow. There was a heaviness in the air, a whispering presence, but no one else seemed to notice it. After a quick dinner, Holmes instructed me to rest for the night while he reviewed his notes in isolation. I knew better than to disturb him during such moments. His mind worked in ways that I could scarcely follow, and when it was in motion, it moved with the same inexorable momentum as a train on its tracks. The following morning, we set out early, visiting Mrs. Beckett's former residence in Glasgow, a large, ivy-clad townhouse in the West End. The house was secluded, tucked away from the prying eyes of the public, with a high wrought-iron gate that creaked as we approached. Holmes barely seemed to notice the dismal appearance of the property as he pushed open the gate, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. The butler, an elderly man with a grey beard and weathered eyes, greeted us at the door. He had served the Beckett family for years, and his weathered expression revealed little of the turmoil that had marked the household. "May I inquire as to your business?" he asked, his tone polite but wary. "Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson, here to investigate the late Mr. Beckett's affairs," Holmes replied smoothly, his voice betraying no hint of the urgency that lay beneath the surface. The butler nodded, clearly not pleased, but equally unwilling to argue. He led us inside, through a narrow hallway lined with portraits of the Beckett family, each of them looking down with expressions of proud detachment. It was the kind of house that seemed to swallow light, the dimness only accentuated by the heavy curtains drawn over the windows. "Mr. Beckett passed just over 2 months ago," the butler said, as he led us into the sitting room. "His wife has been in mourning ever since." I could see that Holmes was already taking note of the details, his eyes darting across the room as he surveyed every inch. The sitting room was well furnished, but there was a certain coldness to the place, as though it had been abandoned for too long. A collection of books, once neatly stacked on a side table, had now fallen into disarray. The fireplace was unlit, its blackened grate a stark contrast to the polished furniture. Yet it was the smell in the room, faint but pungent, that caught Holmes's attention first. "Rotten wood," he murmured under his breath, taking a slow, deliberate breath in through his nose. Curious. The butler seemed taken aback by the remark, but said nothing. Holmes, however, turned his attention to the fireplace, his fingers brushing the edges of the logs. "I would like to examine the study," he said, his voice sharp as ever. "I believe Mr. Beckett's private papers may hold the answers to the puzzle we seek." The butler led us up a narrow staircase, each step creaking beneath our weight. The study, located at the far end of the corridor, was more in keeping with Holmes's expectations, large, imposing and filled with shelves of books, papers, and an array of objects that suggested Mr. Beckett's deep involvement in business affairs. There was a large desk, papers scattered across its surface, and the faintest imprint of a chair where someone had sat recently. Holmes moved toward the desk, flipping through the papers with his usual precision. "Ah," he said, "this is interesting." I moved closer to see what had caught his attention, a letter, its edges frayed as though it had been handled many times. The words were difficult to make out at first, the ink smudged in places. Holmes squinted, then looked up, a flash of insight crossing his face. "It seems that Mr. Beckett was corresponding with someone," he muttered. Mostly to himself. "A business partner, perhaps, or a confidant. But something here doesn't add up." I leaned in closer, my gaze following his as he continued his inspection. There were no clear clues yet, just a cryptic letter with a name I couldn't quite make out. But I could see Holmes's mind working, piecing things together. "We'll need to see Mrs. Beckett's personal letters," Holmes said at last, folding the letter and slipping it into his coat pocket. "She may hold the key to the mystery we seek, Watson. But there is something more at play here, something that reaches far beyond a mere widow's lament." The quiet rhythm of Holmes's investigation continued, each piece fitting into place as we pressed onward. But with every new discovery, the tension grew. It was clear that this was no ordinary case of murder or inheritance. There was a deeper, more tangled web to unravel, and the widow at the heart of it all was no simple victim. As we left the study, the shadows in the hallway seemed to grow longer, as if they too were closing in on the truth. Holmes's gaze never wavered from his goal, and I could only follow, silently wondering just how much darkness we would uncover before this case reached its final, inevitable conclusion. The day wore on with an almost oppressive slowness, as if the very air in Glasgow had thickened around us. We returned to Mrs. Beckett's residence, where she awaited us, her eyes clouded with the same unease that had marked our first meeting. It was clear that her burden was one of more than just grief. She was weighed down by something far darker, something she seemed reluctant to voice. Holmes wasted no time in questioning her once we were settled in the drawing room. His approach was always methodical, his questions precise but never hurried. He knew well that the truth would come, but it would come only if it were coaxed out gently, layer by layer. "Mrs. Beckett," he began, his tone unshakably calm, "I've seen the correspondence your husband kept. There was a letter, a recent one. It was addressed to someone you may know." The widow's eyes widened, and she clutched the arm of her chair, her fingers white with the pressure. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, her voice thickening with the strain. "My husband was a private man. His affairs were his own, and I never looked into them." Holmes regarded her for a moment, his eyes steady, as though weighing the truth in her gaze. "You're certain of that, Mrs. Beckett?" he asked, his voice like a scalpel dissecting her every word. "You never looked into your husband's affairs?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly, her eyes drifting downward as if the weight of her own denial had become too heavy to bear. "No," she whispered, "I never did. But I suspect that perhaps I should have." Holmes leaned forward, his fingers drumming lightly on the arm of his chair. "You've said something that I find rather telling, Mrs. Beckett. Perhaps I should have. What changed?" Her eyes met his, and for the first time something akin to fear flickered there. Fear that wasn't merely for herself, but for something more elusive. "I've been receiving threats," she said quietly, her voice now barely above a whisper. "Letters. Anonymous letters warning me of danger, telling me that I too will meet the same fate as my husband's." Holmes studied her, his gaze sharp. "And these letters, how long have they been arriving?" "For several weeks now," she replied, the words tumbling out as though she could no longer keep them contained. "At first I thought they were the ravings of a madman. But then things started happening. Strange things. A man in the shadows outside my window. And—" she broke off suddenly, her hand flying to her throat as though the memory was choking her. Holmes gave her a moment, his patience infinite, before he spoke again. "And what, Mrs. Beckett?" She hesitated, fighting the tremor in her voice. "I believe I'm being watched. I don't know how else to explain it. The man, the one I saw outside. I swear I saw him at my window just before my husband's death." Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. "This man, did you recognize him?" She shook her head, her brow furrowing in confusion. "No, he was just a shadow in the mist. But I saw him. I saw him clearly enough to know he was there." Holmes stood, his mind already working over the implications of this new information. "We'll need to investigate this man," he said, "and I believe your husband's business dealings may hold the key to uncovering who he is and why he's targeting you." He turned to me, his eyes gleaming with the sharp clarity of someone on the verge of discovery. "Watson, it seems we have much to unravel here. Mrs. Beckett's life is entangled with forces she does not fully understand, forces that have now cast their shadow over her once again." Later that evening, we made our way to the small, dismal office where Mr. Beckett had conducted much of his business. The building was tucked away on a narrow side street, a place where the sounds of the city seemed muffled, as though the very walls sought to conceal its secrets. The office was dark, and the air was heavy with the scent of ink, dust, and disuse. Holmes immediately began sifting through the papers, his hands moving with a practiced efficiency that was almost mechanical. "I don't suppose you ever came here, Mrs. Beckett?" he asked, not looking up from the scattered ledgers before him. She shook her head, glancing around the dimly lit room with a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. "No, I never came, but I knew he worked here. He would come here every evening after dinner." Holmes' brow furrowed as he examined a particular ledger, one filled with meticulous entries detailing payments, contracts, and accounts that seemed rather mundane at first glance. But to Holmes there was an underlying current, a rhythm that suggested something was amiss. This man, this shadowy figure you mentioned, he may be connected to Mr. Beckett's business, Holmes said, his voice steady, his mind already several steps ahead. And if he is, then we must look deeper into these ledgers. There is a pattern here, Watson. I'm certain of it. I leaned over his shoulder, scrutinizing the pages with him. It took only a few moments before I spotted the anomaly, a series of transactions made to an unnamed recipient, payments that had no clear source or purpose. The amounts were substantial, and the dates coincided with the most troubling events in Mrs. Beckett's timeline. Holmes looked at me, his expression one of quiet triumph. There it is, Watson. This is where the puzzle begins to take shape. The mystery of the third widow is no longer simply a matter of fortune or fate. It's something far more deliberate, and I suspect we are about to uncover something far darker than we imagined. As we continued to pore over the documents, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows pressing in around us, as if the answers we sought were not only hidden in these papers, but wrapped in a veil of danger that we had yet to fully comprehend. The hunt was on. As the night deepened, and the only light in the office came from the faint glow of the gas lamps outside, Holmes and I continued to sift through the documents. The office, once filled with the hum of business, now seemed oppressive and closed off. The faint rustle of paper was the only sound that accompanied our thoughts. It wasn't long before Holmes grew still, his fingers pausing over a particular entry in the ledger. "This," he murmured, almost to himself, "this is it." I leaned in, narrowing my eyes as I studied the page before us. Holmes had circled a series of payments made to an overseas account in Rotterdam, amounts large enough to suggest a considerable business venture. But what stood out to me was the recipient's name, or more accurately, the lack of one. The entries were signed only with a cryptic initial, FM, I repeated. "Any ideas, Holmes?" Holmes straightened, his eyes glinting with the sharpness of a mind already piecing the puzzle together. "The mystery is deepening, Watson, but this is a promising lead. A business transaction like this, with such a high level of secrecy, is no mere coincidence. Someone is pulling the strings, and it is not simply a matter of finance, it is a matter of control, of manipulation." I felt a stirring unease in the pit of my stomach, as if the very air had thickened around us. "But who is this person, FM? Could it be connected to the mysterious man Mrs. Beckett saw?" "That, Watson, is precisely what I intend to find out," Holmes replied, rising from his chair and pacing the room, his mind already calculating the next steps. "This name is crucial. We need to investigate Rotterdam and see if we can trace this individual, whether FM is a person, an alias, or something more." But even as Holmes spoke, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that we were already too deep into something that had been carefully planned. Mrs. Beckett's husband had not just died. His death was a message, a warning to someone. But to whom? "We must act swiftly," Holmes said, his voice filled with purpose as he turned to me. "Tomorrow we travel to Rotterdam. But first, there are others we must speak to." The following morning, the streets of Glasgow were thick with fog, the world seeming suspended in an eerie half-light. Holmes was already prepared to leave, a sense of urgency in his every movement. We made our way back to Mrs. Beckett's townhouse, the weight of the past few days pressing down on my shoulders. The pieces were slowly coming together, but each new discovery seemed to open up more questions than answers. When we arrived, Mrs. Beckett greeted us with a nervous smile, her eyes flicking back and forth as though she was unsure whether to trust us or not. She had clearly not slept well. I didn't know what to do with the information you gave me," she confessed, her voice quivering. "But I've decided that I must tell you everything." "I must," Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Go on, Mrs. Beckett. What have you been hiding?" She hesitated, her hand wringing the edge of her shawl. "There was something that Mr. Beckett had kept from me. I didn't know about the payments, not until last night, but I think there's more. Much more. He was seeing someone, and I think that person might be connected to these threats I've been receiving." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Who was he seeing, Mrs. Beckett?" Her face paled. "Her name was Cecilia Hawthorne. She was a woman he met some time ago, just after we were married. I didn't know about her at first, but I found letters. He tried to hide them from me. This new revelation shifted the ground beneath my feet. What kind of letters? I asked, feeling a sense of growing tension. They were passionate, full of promises, Mrs. Beckett said, her voice breaking. He was planning to leave me, I think. But then something happened, and I believe she threatened him. I think he might have tried to break it off with her. And that's when the problems started. Holmes's expression remained calm, but I could see the rapid deductions flashing across his mind. Cecilia Hawthorne, he repeated as if tasting the name. This woman may hold the key to understanding why your husband is dead, and why you are now in danger, Mrs. Beckett. Mrs. Beckett nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I never thought I would be a part of such a terrible thing. But now I know. She's the one who's behind all of this. Holmes stood and turned toward the door, his mind already shifting to the next stage of the investigation. We will find Cecilia Hawthorne, Mrs. Beckett, he said, his voice firm, and we will uncover the truth. By late afternoon, we had arranged our travel to Rotterdam. The trail was growing colder, but Holmes was unrelenting. His mind was already tracing connections that I could not yet see, but I trusted his instincts. The pieces were all pointing to a conspiracy far more elaborate than we had initially imagined, one that could have dire consequences for Mrs. Beckett. As we boarded the train for the port, I couldn't help but feel that we were walking a tightrope, one wrong step, and we might find ourselves trapped in the same web that had ensnared Mr. Beckett. But Holmes had never been one to shy away from danger. And as we crossed the threshold into a world of shadows and secrets, I could only hope that we would uncover the truth before it was too late. The journey to Rotterdam was uneventful, the rhythmic clatter of the train providing a steady backdrop to my thoughts. Holmes sat opposite me, his gaze distant, as though the weight of the case was pulling him into a world where only the smallest details mattered. I had learned long ago that when Holmes became this absorbed, the answer to the mystery was within reach, yet the road to it was often winding and full of unexpected twists. As we neared the port city, the fog of Glasgow seemed to cling to my thoughts, refusing to lift. Mrs. Beckett's words haunted me. Cecilia Hawthorne, a woman of passion and menace, who had been entangled with Mr. Beckett and who, it seemed, now held the key to understanding his death. But there was more to it, wasn't there? Holmes had not yet said it aloud, but I knew that his mind was working on the idea that the payments to the mysterious FM and Cecilia Hawthorne were connected, a thread woven tightly into the fabric of a much larger conspiracy. Rotterdam greeted us with its usual cold, industrial bleakness. The city was alive with the sounds of ships being unloaded, the air thick with the smell of salt and metal. Holmes, ever the keen observer, wasted no time in setting the course. The first stop was the local police station, where Holmes had arranged for access to any records or leads that could shed light on Cecilia Hawthorne's whereabouts. The station itself was modest, tucked away in one of the quieter streets near the harbour. We were met by a short, stern-faced officer who looked us over with the practiced wariness of someone accustomed to dealing with foreign visitors. Holmes flashed a brief smile, one that held the faintest hint of his usual charm, and introduced himself with his usual air of authority. "We're here to look into a woman named Cecilia Hawthorne," Holmes began, his voice clear but clipped. "She may be involved in a case of utmost importance, and we need your assistance in locating her." The officer's eyes flickered momentarily with recognition, and I could see that this name, Hawthorne, struck a chord. Without a word, he led us through the station and into a small, cluttered office. The walls were covered with old case files and maps, the air stale with the scent of paper and dampness. He pulled out a file marked with the name Hawthorne and placed it on the desk before us. "This is the woman you seek?" he asked, his accent thick as he slid the file toward Holmes. Holmes barely glanced at it before flipping it open. The contents were sparse, just a few mentions of her name in connection with a series of financial dealings and one rather curious incident. It seemed that Cecilia Hawthorne had arrived in Rotterdam several months ago under an assumed name, but had kept a low profile. The most intriguing detail, however, was a brief mention of a ship, the Isabella, a freighter that had made a number of suspicious voyages from Rotterdam to a series of ports, including London. "This is it, Watson," Holmes said, his finger tapping the document with a quiet finality. "The Isabella is our link. It seems she has been using the shipping routes to transport more than just goods. I leaned in, studying the file over his shoulder. So, you think she's involved in smuggling? Holmes didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the name the Isabella, as if the ship itself held some deeper significance. Smuggling, yes, he finally said, but I suspect something more intricate than that. Hawthorne is cleverer than we've given her credit for. She's been using her connections to mask her true intentions. The officer looked between us, clearly unsure of how to proceed. We know of the Isabella, he said, his voice tinged with hesitation, but it's not easy to track. The ship is registered under a different name in every port. Whoever controls it has managed to cover their tracks well. Holmes's lips tightened. So that's where we come in. We left the station with renewed purpose, but the road ahead was not as simple as Holmes made it seem. Rotterdam's industrial sector was vast, and locating the Isabella amidst the maze of warehouses, docks, and freighters would take time. Holmes, however, was not a man to be easily deterred. He had already begun calculating our next steps, each one more methodical than the last. That evening, after a quick dinner at a local tavern, Holmes outlined his plan. We'll begin with the dockyard workers. They are often overlooked by the authorities, but they know the ins and outs of every vessel that passes through these waters. We'll find someone who's seen the Isabella. We spent the next few hours in the darkened corners of Rotterdam's port, questioning sailors, workers, and anyone else who might have had a glimpse of the ship or its crew. It wasn't until late in the evening that a dock worker, an elderly man with a weathered face, confirmed something that made my pulse quicken. I remember the Isabella, he said, his voice hushed, as if speaking too loudly might bring trouble. Strange ship, that one. Comes in late at night, never during the day, and always with a man who's dressed like he's running from something. Holmes's expression was unreadable, but I could see the flicker of realization in his eyes. The man, he said, his voice steady. Did you see him clearly? Can you describe him? The dock worker nodded slowly. Tall, dark hair, always wearing a long coat. He never speaks much, just walks onto the ship, then disappears below deck. Holmes stood up abruptly. This man is connected to Hawthorne, and I believe we are now on the verge of uncovering the truth. We need to find the Isabella, and we need to find it tonight. The hunt was closing in on us. There was no more room for hesitation, no more time for contemplation. We had followed the threads of the mystery to Rotterdam, and now the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The shadow of Cecilia Hawthorne, and whatever secret she was guarding, loomed larger than ever. The night was thick with a damp chill as Holmes and I made our way down the labyrinth of dimly lit alleys towards the dockyard. The shadows seemed to stretch endlessly around us, the eerie quiet punctuated only by the distant clatter of industry. I could feel the weight of the case bearing down on us. The discovery of the Isabella seemed imminent, yet I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the deeper we delved, the more dangerous our path would become. Holmes moved with purpose, his steps quick, his mind undoubtedly already racing ahead of the moment. He had been unusually silent ever since we'd learned of the mysterious man aboard the Isabella. Whoever he was, Holmes had a hunch about his significance, though he had yet to share his reasoning with me. It's a matter of time, Watson, Holmes had said earlier, his voice like steel. We're on the edge of unraveling something much larger than we anticipated. The Isabella is merely the surface. We need to find the man who walks aboard her. We reached the waterfront and the stench of salt and oil hung heavy in the air. The sound of waves lapping against the docks provided a rhythmic counterpoint to our footsteps. Holmes paused, scanning the rows of ships moored along the docks. There were many vessels here, each one casting long shadows against the water, but we had no time to waste. We needed to find the Isabella, and quickly. Holmes' eyes narrowed as they flicked over the ships. The dock worker's description was clear, Watson. A man dressed like he's running from something. A man with no business but to disappear. He's aboard the Isabella, and tonight we find him. We continued our search, moving quietly past the creaking ships. Every now and then we'd pass workers loading crates or sailors chatting among themselves, but none seemed to be the man we sought. Finally, after what seemed like an age, Holmes stopped in front of a large freighter. Its name, the Isabella, was painted in bold white letters across its hull. Holmes' lips pressed into a tight line. There it is, he muttered, more to himself than to me. Now we wait. We took cover behind a stack of crates, our eyes fixed on the ship. It was strange. The ship seemed to be almost waiting too, as though it was anticipating our arrival. The night had grown even darker, and the atmosphere felt like a heavy blanket settling around us. It wasn't long before we saw movement. A figure cloaked in a long dark coat appeared on the deck, slipping silently from the shadows. He moved quickly and purposefully, as if he had done this countless times before. The man's presence was almost ghostly, his face obscured by a low-brimmed hat, but there was something in the way he moved that immediately struck me. There was no hesitation in his steps, no glancing over his shoulder. It was the walk of a man who had been on the run and was still running. "That's him," Holmes whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the water. "The man we've been looking for." The figure disappeared below deck without a sound. Holmes motioned for me to follow, and we slipped quietly out from behind the crates, making our way toward the gangplank. The cold wind bit into my skin as we approached the ship, the silence between us broken only by the sound of our footsteps. Holmes led the way, his movements as deliberate and quiet as a shadow. We reached the top of the gangplank and stood just outside the entrance to the ship. Holmes hesitated for a moment, his ear pressed to the door as if listening for something. "There's no time to waste, Watson," he said, his voice low but firm. "We'll need to move quickly." I nodded, my hand instinctively moving to the pistol at my side. I wasn't sure what we would find once we entered, but I had no doubt it would be dangerous. Holmes pushed the door open slowly, and we crept inside. The air was thick with the smell of oil and wood, the creaking of the ship's frame giving an eerie soundtrack to the silence that enveloped us. We moved down a narrow corridor, our footsteps muffled against the worn planks of the deck. Holmes stopped abruptly, his hand raised to signal me to be still. He tilted his head toward a nearby cabin, where faint voices could be heard from within. Holmes turned to me, his eyes sharp with purpose. "We're getting close," he whispered. "I want you to stay behind me. Let me do the talking." I nodded, though the unease in my chest continued to grow. Whatever secrets the Isabella and her mysterious crew were hiding, we were about to uncover them. Holmes made his way toward the door, his hand hovering just inches from the handle. I followed his lead, my mind racing with possibilities. The voices were now clearer, low murmurs that were laced with an urgency I couldn't ignore. Holmes paused for a moment, listening intently. Then, without a sound, he pushed the door open. Inside, the dimly lit cabin was sparse, with only a desk cluttered with papers and a few chairs scattered around. The man in the long coat stood with his back to us, speaking to someone in a thick foreign accent. He didn't seem to notice us enter, and for a moment the scene was almost frozen, like a picture on the verge of being shattered. Holmes stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding. "I think it's time we had a word, wouldn't you agree?" The man spun around, his eyes narrowing. For a split second I thought he might flee, but then his gaze hardened. He was not one for fear, but for calculation. "Sherlock Holmes," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "I've been expecting you." The pieces were finally falling into place. The shadowy figure aboard the Isabella, the mysterious payments to FM, and the threats surrounding Mrs. Beckett, all were converging in this moment. Holmes had drawn the threads of the investigation together, and now we stood on the precipice of the truth. Holmes' expression remained unchanged, but I could see the flicker of triumph in his eyes. "I doubt you'll be expecting what happens next," he replied quietly. The silence that followed was thick with tension, each of us waiting for the next move in this dangerous game. The man's eyes flashed with something that might have been a spark of surprise, quickly masked by an impassive mask of resolve. He didn't flinch, didn't move. He simply regarded Holmes as if sizing him up, considering whether this was truly the confrontation he had been expecting. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us hanging like the taut string of a bow, ready to snap. Holmes remained perfectly still, his sharp eyes never leaving the man's face. "I believe we've both been searching for answers, and it seems, Mr. Hawthorne, that we've finally found one another." The man stiffened at the name, his lips twitching, betraying a hint of recognition. "I don't know who you're talking about," he said, his voice low but edged with tension. The accent was unmistakable now, no longer a subtle foreign intonation, but thick and deliberate, as though each word was carefully chosen. Holmes stepped closer, his posture casual, but his voice colder. "I think you do. You see, Mr. Hawthorne, we've traced a series of payments, letters, and certain inconsistencies. I'd like to know exactly what you're doing on the Isabella, what you're smuggling and who you're working for." The man's face betrayed nothing, but his eyes flickered, and for a brief second, I thought I saw a flash of fear. Or was it calculation? Before he could answer, Holmes continued, "You've been hiding in plain sight, haven't you? A shadow moving through the dark, operating from behind the scenes. But every shadow has an origin, Mr. Hawthorne, and yours ends here." The man's jaw clenched. "You're not going to make it easy, are you?" He took a step backward, and I tensed instinctively, wondering if he was about to bolt. Holmes didn't flinch. "Easy," Holmes said with a slight smirk. "I'm not here to make anything easy. I'm here to end this." The tension in the air was so thick I could almost taste it. I could see the man weighing his options, his mind calculating 1,000 outcomes in a split second. He finally spoke, his voice steady but colder than before. "It's not just about the money, you know," he said, his gaze flickering toward the window, as though checking for something. "This goes much deeper. You don't know the forces at play here, Holmes." "You don't know who you're dealing with." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Try me." The man seemed to struggle for a moment, his lips twitching as though he was about to speak but was fighting the urge to remain silent. It was clear now that we were at a crossroads, and the man's decision would determine how this confrontation would unfold. Would he divulge the truth, or would he turn this into a chase? Finally, he let out a soft, almost inaudible sigh. "The people I'm working for, they're not just interested in wealth, Holmes. They're interested in power, real power. And if you think this is just about the Isabella or some money laundering, you're mistaken." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Power? What kind of power are you talking about?" The man's lips curled into a tight, bitter smile. "The kind of power that can control everything. The kind of power that allows you to manipulate entire industries, governments, people. You've been too focused on the surface of things. But it's all connected, Holmes. Every murder, every missing person, every deal." Holmes didn't move, but his eyes betrayed an almost imperceptible flicker of intrigue. "Go on." The man hesitated again, but this time there was no fear in his eyes, only resolve. "There are organizations, Holmes, hidden within the cracks of society. They pull strings. The Isabella is just a small part of it, a small part of something much larger. I'm just a pawn in a much bigger game. And so are you." Holmes took a step closer, his voice calm, though there was a trace of steel beneath it. "I've seen plenty of games, Mr. Hawthorne. I'm not impressed. Who are these people? Who's behind it all?" The man took another step back, his hand inching toward his coat pocket, and for a moment I thought he might reach for a weapon. I prepared myself, my hand tightening on the grip of my own pistol, ready to act if necessary. But before he could make any move, Holmes spoke again, his voice laced with that calm assurance that made it impossible to doubt him. "You've made one mistake, Mr. Hawthorne," Holmes said, his voice unwavering. "You've underestimated me. And now it's too late." In that instant, the door to the cabin flew open, and a group of men burst in, their faces grim and determined. They were armed, pistols drawn, their eyes hard as they assessed the scene. The man before us, Hawthorne, froze, his face falling into an expression of disbelief. Holmes didn't flinch. "It's over," he said simply, his tone the same as if he were discussing a chess move. "You'll be arrested. All of this ends tonight." Hawthorne's eyes flickered between Holmes and the men now surrounding him, a mixture of defiance and fear crossing his face. He knew it was futile to fight. His time had run out, but just as Holmes's men moved to arrest him, the door to the cabin slammed shut with a violent bang, and a figure stepped forward from the shadows. The woman who appeared was striking, tall, her features sharp, and her eyes locked onto Holmes with a cold fury. She was the last person I had expected to see. Cecilia Hawthorne. Holmes froze, his entire demeanor shifting in an instant. The calculated calm we'd seen from him was replaced by something I'd rarely witnessed, something akin to recognition. He knew her. "You're too late," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "This game is just beginning." And with that, everything changed. The figure that had entered the room was unmistakable. Cecilia Hawthorne, the woman we had been hunting for, and the one whose involvement in this tangled web of deceit had only begun to reveal itself. Her presence was commanding, as though she had been orchestrating every move behind the scenes. Holmes, for all his keen intellect and seemingly unshakable composure, looked momentarily disarmed, his expression betraying a flicker of recognition. This was no ordinary adversary. She was the linchpin, the missing piece that had eluded us. For a moment there was only silence between us, the air heavy with tension. Hawthorne's eyes, cold and calculating, never left Holmes, as though she were waiting for him to make the next move. It was a silence that stretched far too long, and I felt the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Like the calm before a storm, Holmes was the first to break the stillness, his voice as measured and precise as ever. "Cecilia Hawthorne," he said, his tone neutral but laced with an edge I hadn't heard before. "I didn't expect to find you here, though I suppose in hindsight it should have been obvious. You've been pulling the strings, haven't you?" She tilted her head slightly, a wry smile curling at the corner of her lips. "I've been watching you, Holmes," she said, her voice smooth and controlled. "You've been so close to the truth, yet you've missed the larger picture." Holmes's eyes narrowed, his mind already processing the implications of her words. "Missed the larger picture?" he repeated. "I don't believe I've missed anything. The truth has been unfolding before us piece by piece. And you, Cecilia, are the final piece of this puzzle." She stepped forward, her presence almost predatory, as though she were sizing him up. "You think you understand, but you don't," she said, her voice low, almost intimate. "You've been so focused on the transactions, the men in the shadows and the game that's been played in the dark. But you haven't realized what's really at stake." "Not yet." Holmes didn't flinch. "Then enlighten me." Her smile deepened, but there was no humor in it. "This isn't just about power or money or influence. Those are tools. The real goal is much more profound than that. What we're building, Mr. Holmes, is a new order. A world where the strings are pulled by those who truly understand how the world works. A world where control is no longer left to chance." Her words hung in the air like a dark promise, and I could feel the tension rising, thick and palpable. I glanced at Holmes, but his face was unreadable, his mind clearly working 100 steps ahead. He had dealt with conspiracies before, but there was something about her certainty, that seemed different from anything we'd encountered thus far. Holmes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her with a quiet intensity, as though weighing her words carefully. "And you're the one who intends to create this new order," he said finally, his voice steady, though I could detect a faint undercurrent of disdain. "I imagine the death of your husband was merely a stepping stone to a much larger plan." At this, Cecilia's eyes flashed with something darker, something far more dangerous. "You think this is about a single life?" she asked, her tone colder now. "You really have no idea what you're up against. This isn't just about Mr. Beckett, it never was." The realization hit me like a bolt. Her words were laced with something far more sinister than I had anticipated. This wasn't a matter of revenge or greed. It was something much grander, more calculated and more devastating. She had been laying the groundwork for something that would shake the very foundations of society itself. "And how far does this new order go?" Holmes asked, his voice sharp now, as though he were beginning to piece together the full scope of her plan. "How many lives are you willing to destroy to make your vision a reality?" Cecilia's gaze hardened. "As many as it takes," she said coldly. "In the end, the sacrifices are worth it. The world is weak. It needs to be remade, reshaped, and controlled by those who understand the true nature of power." I could feel the weight of her words, and I knew without a doubt that she wasn't speaking merely in metaphor. She believed in her cause, in her vision, and she would stop at nothing to see it realized. The stakes had just been raised to an entirely new level, and the dangerous game we had thought we were playing was suddenly much more profound, more global than we had imagined. Holmes' eyes never wavered from hers, and his voice, though calm, held an edge of warning. "You've underestimated the resistance you'll face. People like you always do. You may think you're playing chess, but the world is not as easily controlled as you believe." Her lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold, unfeeling certainty of someone who was already convinced of their own triumph. "You can try, Mr. Holmes, but in the end, you will be nothing more than a footnote in the history of what is coming." Holmes seemed to consider her words, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something, perhaps recognition, perhaps something more profound. It was then that I understood. This wasn't just about catching a criminal or solving a case. This was about a battle for the future, one that transcended mere investigation. It was a war of ideologies, and we were standing in the heart of it. Before I could voice any thoughts, the door behind us creaked open. Two men stepped in, their faces masked by the shadows, but their presence was unmistakable. They were not mere henchmen. They exuded an air of quiet menace, their movements deliberate and controlled. Cecilia's gaze shifted briefly to them, then back to Holmes. "I suppose this is where our conversation ends," she said, her voice almost regretful, as if she had hoped for a different outcome. Holmes' eyes locked onto hers, unflinching. "I think this is where it begins." With that, the room seemed to close in around us. The game was no longer just about solving a mystery. It was about survival. And the stakes had never been higher. The tension in the room thickened as the two men behind Cecilia stepped forward, their eyes scanning the space with the predatory calm of individuals who had seen enough danger to know how to control it. They weren't ordinary thugs. They carried themselves with military precision, their movements calculated, their eyes sharp. Holmes stood motionless, his gaze locked on Cecilia, and I could see his mind working furiously, piecing together the implications of her words, the men at her side, and the scale of the conspiracy that we had unwittingly walked into. The pieces of the puzzle were no longer simply scattered. They were assembling into something much more dangerous, a threat that neither of us had truly anticipated. Cecilia's voice broke through the quiet tension, smooth and unbothered. "You think you've come close to stopping this, Mr. Holmes, but let me make something clear." She took a step closer, her heels clicking against the wooden floor with a rhythmic precision that mirrored her control over the situation. "You can't stop what's already in motion. This, everything you've been investigating, is just the beginning. It's just the beginning." Holmes took a deep breath, his eyes flickering briefly toward me, and for a moment I felt the weight of the situation press down on me too. This wasn't just about a single murder or a missing woman. It was about a network of power, one that stretched far beyond our reach, a world of shadowy dealings, global influence, and a vision for the future that we could scarcely begin to understand. "You underestimate the power of information, Cecilia," Holmes replied, his voice steady. "But there was a noticeable edge to it now. You've made one fatal mistake. You've assumed that the world you're trying to control is as easily manipulated as you think." Cecilia's smile widened, but there was no humor in it. "You still don't understand, do you? I've been in control from the beginning. You've been chasing false leads, stumbling through half-truths. All the while, I've been the one pulling the strings." The realization hit me like a jolt of electricity, and I glanced over at Holmes, who seemed to be grasping the full extent of what she was saying. She wasn't just an individual acting on her own. She was part of a much larger organized effort, a movement that spanned across borders, controlling industries, governments, and lives. This wasn't about a handful of corrupt businessmen or rogue operatives. This was an entire undercurrent of power, and it had been in motion for years, perhaps decades. The two men at Cecilia's side moved slightly closer, their eyes never leaving us. One of them, tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably menacing, took a step forward and nodded at Cecilia. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible gesture in return. It was as if she was waiting for something that would signal the next stage of whatever plan she had laid out. Holmes, however, didn't flinch. He was still studying her, his expression calm, but the undercurrent of tension around him was palpable. "You're right about one thing," Holmes said, his voice sharp. "You've been in control, but I'm not quite ready to surrender the world to you just yet." Cecilia's smile deepened, but there was a coldness in her eyes now, a flicker of impatience. "You can't stop us, Holmes. You never could. You're too small a part of this puzzle. The Isabella is just one piece, one small operation. But the network, the real power, it's already spreading, and soon there will be no stopping it." I felt the full weight of her words as they settled into the room. There was a sense of finality in her tone, an eerie certainty that left me with the unmistakable sense that our investigation had been nothing more than a distraction. We had followed the breadcrumbs, but now we were standing in the shadow of something far darker than we could have imagined. Holmes didn't reply immediately. He was processing, his mind whirring as it always did, unraveling the strands of her plan, considering the next move, the next piece of information that might tilt the balance. He was thinking 3 steps ahead, calculating what it would take to stop her and her network. Before he could respond, the tall man who had stepped forward earlier moved again, this time pulling something from his coat, a small, sleek device. With a flick of his wrist, he activated it, and a low, buzzing hum filled the room. The device emitted a soft, almost imperceptible whine, and as it did, the shadows seemed to deepen, the air growing heavier. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, as I felt the strange sensation in the room grow stronger. Cecilia's eyes glinted, and she stepped back, clearly pleased with the effect. "A signal jammer," she said, her voice casual. "We've been monitoring your every move, Mr. Holmes, and now we've taken the liberty of making sure that you won't be able to communicate with the outside world. It's over. You're trapped." The realization hit me then. Our phones, our ability to contact anyone, had been cut off. We were isolated, alone, with no one but each other and the network of power that Cecilia had built. There was no backup, no outside force that could help us now. It was just us, facing a woman who had orchestrated this entire game from the shadows. Holmes's eyes flicked toward me, a glimmer of understanding passing between us. We weren't just facing an investigation anymore. We were in the middle of something far larger, something that threatened not just us, but the very order of the world. The tall man approached, his hand resting on the device, as if waiting for further instructions. Cecilia gave him a subtle nod and he stepped aside, giving us a clear view of her. She was no longer the calm, composed woman she had been moments ago. Now there was an edge to her, a glint of something far more dangerous. "Now," she said, her voice low and commanding, "we begin the real work." Cecilia's words hung in the air like a dark promise. The room seemed to close in around us, as the hum of the signal jammer continued to vibrate through the walls, rendering any hope of outside help non-existent. The tall man, standing by the device, watched us closely, his posture rigid and alert, as though waiting for any sign of resistance. I felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me. We were cut off, isolated in a way that felt almost suffocating. The sense of danger was no longer just abstract. It was palpable, as if the very walls of the ship were pressing inward. Cecilia had made it clear. This wasn't just a game of cat and mouse anymore. This was a battle for control, and we were caught in the middle of it. Holmes, however, remained calm, his eyes never leaving Cecilia's. There was something in his gaze, an intensity, a focus, that suggested he had already begun to process his next move. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, I knew he wouldn't back down. He never did. "Your arrogance is astounding," Holmes said, his voice steady, but with an edge that could cut through steel. "You think this ends with you getting what you want? You've underestimated the people who will come after you, Cecilia. You've overplayed your hand." Cecilia's smile didn't falter. "I'm not concerned about anyone coming after me, Mr. Holmes. The world as you know it is changing. You're too slow, too bound by the old rules. What's coming is inevitable. There's no stopping it now." Her words were chilling in their certainty, and I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. We had been chasing a thread, following breadcrumbs through a maze of deception, only to find ourselves at the center of something far darker than we had ever imagined. And now it seemed the game had shifted completely. Holmes glanced at me, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He had heard enough. "I'm not done yet," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I will stop you, Cecilia. You're not as invincible as you think." Cecilia's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't break her composed facade. She stepped closer to us, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. The two men flanking her shifted slightly, still keeping their eyes on us. It was clear they were ready to act at a moment's notice. "I'm afraid you don't fully understand the situation, Holmes," she said, her voice low and almost soothing, as though she were explaining something to a child. "This isn't about you stopping me. It's about something much larger. The network I've built, it's beyond your reach, beyond your understanding. Even if you manage to escape here, you'll find yourself trapped in a world that no longer follows the rules you've been so comfortable with. You're already too late." Holmes's expression remained unchanged. "I've been too late before, Cecilia, and I've always caught up." For the briefest of moments I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a flash of irritation, perhaps, before she masked it completely. "You're persistent," she said, her tone shifting to something almost mocking. "But it will be your downfall. You think you're the hero in this story. But there are no heroes in this game, just players. "And you, Mr. Holmes, are no different from the rest." I could see Holmes bristle at her words, but he said nothing. He had long since abandoned the notion of heroism. His focus, as always, was on the truth, and on stopping whatever dark scheme Cecilia had set in motion. Just then, there was a faint sound, the creak of a door opening in the distance. It was subtle, but it was enough to draw Cecilia's attention. Her gaze flicked toward the sound, and I saw her tense as though she were waiting for something. Holmes caught the shift in her demeanor instantly, his eyes sharp. "What's happening now?" he asked, his voice low but with a hint of warning. Cecilia didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced at her men who stood poised, waiting for her next command. She didn't need to say a word. They were in sync, already anticipating her instructions. The air grew heavier, the tension thickening in the room as we waited for whatever was coming next. I followed Cecilia's gaze, trying to discern what had drawn her attention. In the dim light of the cabin, shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, and I realized with a sudden sinking feeling that the creaking door hadn't come from a distant hallway, it had come from behind us. Without warning, the door to the cabin swung open, revealing a figure standing in the doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with an air of quiet menace about him. His features were hard to make out in the dim light, but there was no mistaking the cold calculation in his eyes. He stepped into the room, his presence immediate and commanding. Holmes shifted slightly, but his eyes never left Cecilia. I could feel the unease spreading through the room. This wasn't just another player. This was someone else, someone who had just entered the game, and from the look on Cecilia's face, he was someone she had been expecting. "Ah," Cecilia said, her voice dripping with faint amusement. "It seems our conversation is about to become more interesting." Holmes didn't react, but I could see his mind already working, processing this new development. Who was this man, and what role did he play in all of this? The man stepped further into the room, his eyes briefly scanning the scene before landing on Cecilia. "It's time," he said, his voice low and gravelly, with a hint of authority that made the air feel even colder. Cecilia gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and I knew then that whatever was happening next would change everything. The game had shifted again. What had seemed like a battle for survival now felt like the beginning of something much larger, something that neither Holmes nor I had truly prepared for, and as the man's presence filled the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that the true danger was only just beginning. As the figure in the doorway stepped fully into the room, I could feel the tension rising to a breaking point. Holmes remained utterly still, his gaze now shifting between the man and Cecilia. For a brief moment, the silence was suffocating, as though all the secrets of this twisted game hung in the air, waiting to be revealed. The man didn't look at me or Holmes. His eyes were solely focused on Cecilia. There was no recognition, no acknowledgement that we were even there. He was the sort of man who lived in the shadows, his presence both silent and overpowering, a necessary part of the machinery Cecilia had built. "Is it time, then?" Cecilia's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a decision made long ago. She had orchestrated this moment, and now it seemed it had arrived. The man nodded once, his lips curling into a grim smile. "It's time." The words hung in the air, but Holmes didn't flinch. He had learned to read between the lines, and something in the man's demeanor told him that the game had already been decided. This wasn't about finding the truth anymore. This was about survival. "What exactly is it that you've been playing at, Cecilia?" Holmes finally asked, his voice calm but laced with a new, more dangerous clarity. "I'm not asking you to explain your so-called new order. I'm asking you to tell me how you thought you could get away with it." Cecilia's smile remained fixed, but there was a subtle change in her expression. It was as if she were finally acknowledging the inevitability of the moment, the fact that Holmes had, once again, unraveled the core of her plan. "You've been chasing shadows." "Holmes," she said, her voice tinged with something between admiration and contempt. "You've put together pieces of the puzzle, but you'll never see the full picture. It's already done. The network is already in place. No one can stop it now." Holmes stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "You're wrong. The truth always finds a way to come to light." "It always does." She laughed softly, but there was no mirth in it. "Do you really think you're in control of anything here? Do you believe you're the one who holds the power in this equation?" Her gaze flicked over to the man behind her, then back to Holmes, her eyes narrowing. "You've played your part, Mr. Holmes, but this is bigger than you could ever comprehend." In that moment I understood. This wasn't just about one conspiracy, one criminal plot. Cecilia and her network were attempting something on a global scale, shaping the world's future with shadowy alliances and manipulation of governments and industries. They were creating a new order, one that would render everything Holmes had spent his life fighting against irrelevant. And Holmes, for all his genius, had been too late to stop it. But then I saw something shift in Holmes. He had heard the finality in her words, and he had understood the scope of the threat. But he wasn't done. "Not yet, you're right," Holmes said quietly. "I'm not in control. But you've made one critical mistake, Cecilia." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. "Oh, and what mistake is that?" "You've underestimated me." Before Cecilia could react, Holmes was moving with a swiftness that surprised even me. He lunged toward the signal jammer, reaching for it in a single fluid motion. The man behind Cecilia reacted too late, stepping forward but too slow. Holmes yanked the device from the table, and in one decisive move, he slammed it to the ground. The hum of the jammer stopped instantly, and the room was suddenly filled with the sounds of the ship, the creaking of wood, the distant crash of waves against the hull, and the unmistakable silence that followed the sudden absence of the jammer's interference. We could hear everything now. Outside, inside, the possibility of communication restored. Cecilia's eyes widened, a flicker of panic crossing her face for the first time. Her control was slipping, and she knew it. Holmes had cut through the layers of her plans with one swift action. The final piece had fallen into place, and for the first time in a long while she was no longer in control. "You think this will stop me?" Cecilia hissed, her composure cracking. "You think you can undo everything I've done?" Holmes stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "I don't need to undo anything, Cecilia. You've already exposed your hand, and it's over. The truth is out." The man behind her hesitated, then took a step forward, clearly unsure of how to proceed now that the tables had turned. But before he could act, the door to the cabin opened again. This time it wasn't just one figure. It was a small group of uniformed officers, their presence unmistakable. They had arrived finally, after all the pieces had been put into place. Cecilia's face fell, her expression darkening. She had underestimated Holmes not once but twice. The game was over. "Your network is finished," Holmes said, his voice low but certain. "The truth will spread faster than you can control it." Cecilia's lips trembled, her eyes flashing with fury. But as the officers moved in, she knew it was futile. There was no escape now. Her carefully constructed empire, her world of shadow and manipulation, had collapsed under the weight of one man's relentless pursuit of truth. As the officers arrested her, I looked over at Holmes. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction, only the quiet understanding that the work was never really finished. The battle may have been won, but the war against those who would use power for their own ends was far from over. But for now, Cecilia Hawthorne, the architect of the shadowy network that had almost reshaped the world, was defeated, and the truth, as always, had triumphed.